My name is Adiz and I am 34. 3 weeks ago, I sat across from my parents at the kitchen table in the house where I grew up. My mother had placed a single printed document on the table between us. It had bullet points. It had dates. At the bottom, it said I owed this family an apology and a return. She pushed it across the table the way she had always handled things. She wanted to be final, deliberately, with both hands, eyes level. But here is what they did not know. I had a folder. I had been building it for 15 years. 29 items, all labeled, all dated. And not one of them supported the story they had been telling about me since I was 19 years old. I grew up in Akron, Ohio. Population just under 200,000 when I was a child. The kind of city where the neighborhoods each have their own gravity, where you can tell which block a person is from by how they carry themselves at the gas station or at church on Sunday morning. We lived on the east side, in a brick house on a street with a single oak tree at the corner that dropped leaves nobody ever fully raked. There was a diner 3 blocks away where my father stopped every morning at 6:12. I know the exact time because for 2 summers the first walked to school past it and I could see him through the window at the same table, same cup, same newspaper folded to the same section every single morning. My father, Chukwemeka Obi, worked as a civil engineer for the city government of Akron for 31 years. Same desk. Same route home at 5:48 in the evening. Same silence at the dinner table that was not emptiness but structure, the structure of a man who made decisions and expected the family to organize around them without extensive discussion. He was not a man who explained himself. He loved me. I believe that with most of what I have. But he loved me the way certain men love daughters they cannot quite understand, from a distance, with expectations that were never written down anywhere and disappointment that arrived only as silence. My mother, Neka, was a registered nurse on the overnight shift at St. Thomas for 22 years. She was also, in a more unofficial but equally demanding capacity, the architect of our family's social reputation. She ran the women's committee at Christ Embassy. She organized the neighborhood Thanksgiving drives every year. She knew which families in the Nigerian community had real money and which ones only dressed like it, and she managed that knowledge with a precision I only came to understand as an adult was her primary form of power. She had a mental ledger. Who had helped whom? Who had embarrassed the family and who had brought it credit? Who owed what, and to whom, and when the debt would come due? In our family, reputation was not vanity. Reputation was the asset that everything else ran on. My brother Emeka was 2 years older than me and was, by every metric my parents used, the success the family had been aiming to produce. Engineering degree from a school my mother mentioned by name at social gatherings for years afterward. A steady income. The right friends. Never a wrong word at the dinner table, not because he was afraid but because his preferences and my parents' preferences happened to align, and in our household alignment was indistinguishable from good character. He did not have to work at fitting into the family. He simply fit. I was the one who did not fit. Not because I was a troubled child. I want to be clear about that. I made honor roll every year without exception. I stayed out of the kind of trouble that gets discussed. I ran the debate team in my junior year and placed 3rd at the state competition, 3rd out of 47 schools. I was not a problem. What I was a person developing her own opinions and preferences and sense of self, in the completely ordinary way that teenagers do this, and in my family, a self that did not reflect my parents' choices back to them was experienced as a threat to the structure regardless of what that self produced. The argument started small. How I wore my hair. A club at school my mother had decided was inappropriate without visiting it once. Opinions at the dinner table that my father experienced as challenges to his authority rather than conversation. None of it was dramatic. None of it was rebellion for its own sake. I was just becoming a person. But by the time I was 16 we were fighting with real regularity, and by 17 the fights had a specific texture that I can only describe as total. They were never about the particular thing in front of us. They were about what I was. My mother had a look she reserved specifically for me, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a 2-second pause before she answered, like she was calculating how to manage whatever I had just introduced into the room. My father's version of the same thing was simpler. He went very quiet, and in our house, my father going very quiet was its own complete sentence. The one figure in my family who operated differently from all of this was my grandmother on my mother's side, Mama Chabiz. She lived in Cleveland, 4 hours away, and she called every Sunday at 7 o'clock in the evening without fail, and she always asked to speak to me first. She wanted to know what I was reading, what I was thinking about, what I had argued about in debate practice that week. She listened to my answers the way people listen when they are actually interested, not waiting for the pause that lets them redirect. She laughed at things I said, real laughter, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine. She sent birthday cards every year in her careful handwriting with a small cross next to her signature. In our family, love had conditions attached to it. There was always a ledger. Mama Chabiz was the exception to every part of that. Hers came with no invoice attached and no revision clause and no terms that were subject to my behavior. There is one memory I keep from my father that I hold apart from everything else. In my junior year, the year I placed third at state, he drove alone to the competition on a Saturday morning during a period when he had a city infrastructure project he could have cited as a reason not to come. He sat in the third row. He did not say anything about the result afterward. He bought me lunch at a restaurant near the venue and asked what argument I was planning to build for next season. That was the closest he came, in all of those years, to telling me he was proud of something I had done. I kept the receipt from that lunch. It is not in the folder. It lives in a different envelope, separate from everything else. I met Daniel in the fall of my freshman year of university. I had been eating lunch at a small cafe near the science building because the main dining hall was too loud for the kind of studying I needed to do that semester, the concentrated kind where you are actually building something in your head rather than just moving information around. He sat down across from me at the only empty seat on a Thursday afternoon in October, apologized for taking the space, and then immediately opened a book, which I found more interesting than if he had tried to start a conversation. He was a sophomore. Environmental Policy. From Savannah, Georgia, from a family that had been there for generations. He had a way of listening when I spoke that I was not used to from people my age, still, genuinely interested, not constructing his next sentence while I was still finishing mine. We studied together that Thursday. And the next. By November we were spending most evenings in that cafe or in the library, and somewhere around December, without any formal conversation about it, we were together. His family was unlike anything I had grown up around. His mother called every Sunday at noon and talked for 40 minutes about everything and nothing, her garden and a neighbor and a cousin's news and what she had cooked that week. His grandmother sent packages with actual home-cooked food wrapped in foil, packed in boxes that smelled like Sunday when he opened them. They called each other on ordinary days for no particular reason. There was no agenda in the calls. There was no ledger being maintained, no social calculation running underneath the warmth. I noticed this the way you notice the absence of a sound you have been so accustomed to that you stopped registering it as sound. Something was missing from their family that had always been present in mine. I understood only much later that what was missing was the cost of belonging. I dated Daniel for 11 months before I told my parents. Not because I was ashamed of him. Because I knew what the information would do and I was not yet strong enough, at 19, working 2 jobs on a partial scholarship with nothing saved, to hold what was coming. He was not Nigerian. He was not from the community. He did not fit the category my mother had decided my future partner must occupy. And I needed one more semester of relative quiet before I could afford the disruption. When I finally told my mother, on a Sunday call in September of my sophomore year, she went silent for 4 seconds. I was watching the clock on my laptop. 4 seconds. Then. You need to end that. I said I was not going to do that. She put my father on the phone. He spoke for 11 minutes without pausing once. I watched the timer on my screen. He told me I was making choices that brought shame on this family. He told me I did not understand what they had given up to build a life in this country. He told me that if I continued with this person, I was choosing to put myself outside this family. I told him I understood his position. I told him I was not ending the relationship. He said, "Then we are done. Do not call this number again." He hung up. I sat at my desk for 20 minutes without moving. Not crying. Not in shock. Just sitting with what had just happened and the specific weight of it and how I was going to carry it forward. Then I picked up a pen and I wrote down everything my father had said on that call, every phrase I could reconstruct, word by word, the order he had said them in, the exact constructions he used. I printed it. I put it in an envelope. I wrote the date on the front in pen, September 23rd. 2 weeks later I came home to collect the last of my things. I had a single bag. I was standing in the driveway, bag in hand, about to get in the car, and my mother came out of the house. She did not raise her voice. She looked at me with the flat, evaluating expression she reserved for things that had stopped being worth managing. She said, "You are dead to us. Do not contact this family again." She went inside. The door closed. I stood in that driveway for 42 seconds. I know because I was counting without choosing to, the way I always counted things. Then I picked up my bag and I walked to my car and I drove back to campus. I did not call them. I did not write a letter. I did not ask Daniel to leave so that a reconciliation could be attempted on their terms. I went to my desk. I took out the envelope from the phone call. I sat down and I typed a second document, everything that had just happened in the driveway, the exact words, the expression on her face, the time of day, the way the door sounded when it closed. I printed it. Second envelope. I wrote the date. I do not know why I did it. Not in the strategic sense. I just knew that what had been said was real and that I did not want to spend the next years wondering if I had remembered it correctly. Item 1. Item 2. The folder was not strategy. It was not planned. It was a 19-year-old woman doing the only thing she had the presence of mind to do with truths that had no other place to live. The items came slowly at first. Then in clusters. Then in steady accumulation over years, the way evidence always does when a situation is actually happening rather than being imagined. Item 3 was the email from my mother, which arrived 4 days after the driveway. 3 paragraphs. Composed, precise, cold in the specific way that very controlled people are cold when they are making something official. It informed me that the family's financial contributions to my education were terminated effective immediately. She listed them, $250 per month toward my tuition gap, $48 per month on the family phone plan, $100 per month she called an allowance but which I had been spending almost entirely on groceries. She wanted me to know the family had been generous. She wanted me to know I had chosen to squander that generosity. I printed it. Filed it. I did not respond. I found a third job the following week. Campus library on weekdays. Restaurant near campus on Friday and Saturday evenings. Tutoring on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I moved into a cheaper apartment share with 2 women I barely knew, in a building without a working elevator. I recalculated the budget until the numbers worked. They worked, barely, with nothing left over for error. And I noticed something about myself in those weeks. The leaner things got, the clearer my thinking became. There was no room for noise. There was only the math and the work and the folder. Item 4 was a birthday card from Mama Chibi's that arrived at my new address in January. She had gotten the address from my Aunt Ngozi through a chain of quiet asking around that I later learned took her 3 weeks and 4 phone calls. The card had small yellow flowers on the front. Inside, in her careful handwriting, she had written, "I am praying for you, my Ada. Do not let them make you small." Signed with her name and a small cross. I filed it not because it was evidence of harm. Because it was evidence of someone who could see me clearly from 4 hours away and who had spent 3 weeks finding my address rather than accept that she could not reach me. The folder needed to hold both kinds of truth. Item 5 was a letter from my Aunt Ngozi in February. She said she was sorry for what had happened. She said she thought I was brave, even though brave was a difficult thing to be when you were 19 and working 3 jobs and eating frozen vegetables most nights. She also told me something I was not yet ready to do anything with, that my mother had told the extended family a version of events in which I had abandoned the family for a boyfriend. No document. No ultimatum. No driveway. Just a daughter who had made her choices and walked away. I read that letter 3 times. After item 5, I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. Not just a family that had rejected me. A family that was telling a story in which they had not rejected me. A story in which I was the one who had chosen to go. Which meant that anyone in the extended community who asked about the situation would already have received a version in which I was the origin of the distance. If I ever tried to correct it, I would be a daughter arguing against her own parents with nothing but her memory, trying to correct a story the entire network had already absorbed and was now repeating. The folder was not revenge. I was not building a case. I was doing what I had always done, keeping an accurate record of what was actually happening, because the alternative was to let someone else's version of my life become the only version that existed anywhere outside my own memory. Item 6 was a message from my brother Emeka in the spring of my 2nd year. 3 sentences. He wanted to know if I would consider apologizing to our parents because our mother's emotional health was suffering and my absence was the cause. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not say whether he believed I had been treated fairly. He asked only if I would apologize, because the absence was hurting them. I did not respond. Item 6. Filed. Dated September 3rd. I graduated in 4.5 years. 1 extra semester, taken part-time in year 3 when the money got genuinely tight and I needed to work more and study less to keep the floor under me. But I graduated. I walked across that stage with no family in the seats. A professor from my junior year, Dr. Harmon, took a photo on her phone when I crossed the stage and texted it to me afterward with a single sentence, "You did something hard." I still have that photo. I am smiling in it, a full, unguarded smile. I did not expect that smile. I looked at it for a long time the first night I had it. I got a job in marketing at a mid-sized firm downtown. I rented my first solo apartment, 4th floor, near the Arts District, 842 square feet, the first space that was entirely mine with no roommates and no one else's schedule imposed on it. I started therapy with a woman named Dr. Pierce who had a particular quality of attention, the ability to let me arrive at realizations without steering me toward them. I told her about the folder on the 4th session. She called up my record. She said, "You are maintaining your relationship with the truth during a period when the truth is being actively revised by people with more social resources than you." I had not framed it that way before. I had thought of it as self-protection. She helped me understand it was also a refusal. A refusal, quiet and methodical, to let the story be taken from me. Daniel and I ended things in year 3 of my career. No drama. No argument. We had built something real and arrived at the natural end of it. His name disappearing from my life did not change my standing with my parents. Not a call. Not a message. Not a reopening of any door. Which confirmed what I had suspected for 3 years, it had never been about Daniel. Year 4. I began a freelance consulting practice on the side, picking up corporate communications contracts on evenings and weekends. The kind of work that pays in multiples of what a salary does if you are willing to show up for it. By year 5 the consulting practice was generating more than my salary at the firm. I made the decision to go independent. It was not dramatic. It was a spreadsheet decision. I ran the numbers for 3 weeks from every angle I could find and the numbers said go. So I went. I gave 6 weeks' notice. I built out my client list. I converted 3 of the firm's accounts to personal clients through a proper referral process that my manager had no objection to and that I documented carefully in writing. I opened a separate business account on a Monday. I set up the LLC on a Tuesday evening at my kitchen table with a glass of water and a form I had downloaded from the state website. I signed it, scanned it, submitted it, and then I sat in the quiet of my apartment for a few minutes with the confirmation on the screen. There was no one to tell. There was no one to call. No parent who would understand what this meant, no family dinner where I could announce it, no one who had been present for the 3-job university years who could now appreciate the distance between that and this. That was fine. I had learned, over 7 years of building my life from the outside in, to take the milestones in quietly and move to the next one. The milestone knew what it was. That was enough. By the end of year 6, I had crossed $200,000 in annual billings for the first time. I noted it in my accounts. I deposited the money. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. The number mattered not because of what it bought but because of what it proved, that the 3-job university years and the lean apartment and the invisible graduation had been load-bearing. That everything I had built from the year I was told I was dead had been built correctly, from the foundation up, with no one's approval needed and no one's support under it. Item 7 was an invitation to my cousin Adana's wedding, passed to me through Ngozi. Her handwritten note said, "I want you there, but your parents will also be there, and I understand if you cannot come." I did not attend. I sent a gift. I filed the invitation and the note. Item 7. Wedding invitation. Ngozi's note attached. May 4th. Item 8 was what Chisholm told me in a call the following Monday. My mother had told relatives at the reception that I had not attended because I was still carrying bitterness and could not bring myself to celebrate family joy. No mention of the driveway. No mention of what had been said to me. Just, Adiz is bitter and could not show up for this family. Chisholm cried on that call for most of an hour. I took notes while she talked. Not because I am cold. Because the notes were the only thing I could control when everything else in the conversation was grief and confusion. Item 8. Wedding report via Chisholm. May 9th. Item 9 was a voicemail from an unknown number in March of year 4, which was recognizably my mother's voice on someone else's phone. She said I needed to understand the pain I was causing this family. That there was still time to make things right. That God was watching my choices. I transcribed it word for word. I played it 3 times. The 3rd time I transcribed it I noticed she said I was causing pain, not that pain had been caused. The grammar of her guilt was always specific. I noted that in the margin of the transcript. Item 9. Voicemail transcript. Unknown number. March 7th. Items 10 through 12 arrived in years 5 and 6 in a cluster. Item 10 was a note relayed through Ngozi containing fragments of what was being said about me in my mother's church circle, that I was doing well for myself, that my mother had always known I was ambitious, that she prayed for me regularly. She always knew I was ambitious. She prayed for me. Filed. Item 11 was a screenshot Ngozi sent me, carefully and apologetically, of a comment my mother had left under a distant cousin's social media post congratulating me on something I had posted publicly about the consulting practice. My mother had written, "I always knew she had it in her. Praying for her always." My mother, who had told me I was dead to her 6 years before, was now publicly claiming credit for the person I had become without her. I looked at that screenshot for a long time. I did not feel angry. I felt accurate. Filed. Item 11. Social media screenshot. Ngozi forwarded. April 22nd. Item 12 was a note in my own handwriting, something I added to the binder for the first time in 6 years of keeping it, a single line recording the date the LinkedIn views from Akron became weekly rather than occasional, and the names of the accounts I could see. I did not know if I was allowed to add my own observations to the folder. Then I decided, it is my record. I am allowed. Filed. Item 12. LinkedIn observation. Self-authored. Year 6, November. Year 6 was also the year I crossed $200,000 in annual billings for the first time. I did not celebrate in any particular way. I noted it in my accounts. I deposited the money. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. The number mattered not because of what it bought but because of what it proved, that the 3-job university years and the lean apartment and the invisible graduation had been load-bearing. That everything I had built from the year I was told I was dead had been built correctly, from the foundation up, with no one's approval needed and no one's support under it. Item 13 was a voicemail from my father, left on October 14th of year 6, a date I can give you exactly because I wrote it on the transcript immediately after I listened to it. He said Mama Chabiz had been diagnosed with something serious and that the family thought I should know. He said if I wanted to reach her, I could do so through Ngozi. He did not say he missed me. He did not say he was sorry. He said the family thought I should know, the way you deliver a courtesy notification to a former employee who has no current stake but is owed a basic procedural consideration. I called Mama Chabiz that evening. 48 minutes. She told me she was not afraid. She asked about my work and my apartment and whether I was eating enough. She said the full story of this family would only be understood later, when everyone involved had more room to see it clearly. She said it the way she said everything, without drama, without performance, as a simple observation about the nature of things. I did not know, sitting on my couch that October evening with the phone pressed to my ear and a cup of tea going cold on the table, that this would be one of the last long conversations I had with her. She died in February. 4 months later. I was told about the funeral arrangements on the morning of the funeral, through a text from Chisholm that contained a time and an address. I do not know if the late notice was deliberate. I drove there. I sat in the back row. I spoke to Ngozi, who held my hand without saying anything for a long time in the way that some people know how to hold another person using only their hands. I did not approach my parents. My mother did not acknowledge that I was in the room. My father looked at me once, for 2 seconds, and looked at the wall behind me. I drove home and I sat in my car in the parking lot of my building for 35 minutes before going inside. Not only from sadness. From the particular and specific grief of losing the one person in that entire family who had always said my name the right way, who had never made me earn it, who had held my phone calls like appointments she looked forward to rather than obligations she fulfilled. The grief was real and large and I let it be both of those things before I went upstairs. Item 14 was the legal notice from the estate attorney. My grandmother had designated equal shares for each grandchild from a specific portion of the estate. My share was $4,200. The notice also informed me that one party had filed a formal contest of my inclusion, on the grounds that I had separated myself from the family before my grandmother's death and should therefore be considered to have forfeited my entitlement. The contesting party was not named. The contest was unsuccessful. My grandmother's will was unambiguous. I received the $4,200. I kept the letter. Item 14. Estate contest. Attorney letter. Dated. Filed behind year 7 tab. I was not building a case. I want to say it again because I want you to understand what those 15 years actually were. I was not planning anything. I was not waiting for a moment. I was doing what I had always done, keeping an accurate record of what was actually happening, because the alternative was to let someone else's version of my life become the only version that existed anywhere outside my own memory. That is all the folder was. Accuracy. Held quietly. For as long as it needed to be held. Year 8. The consulting practice crossed $380,000 in annual billings for the first time in January. I attended a conference in Chicago in March, sat on a panel about brand communication strategy, and received 3 new client inquiries in the week after it. A regional business publication ran a short profile of my practice in April, 600 words, a photo, a quote. Nothing major. But it had my name in it and it was publicly indexed and searchable and it told a story, a true story, about a woman who had built something real. The LinkedIn views from Akron doubled that week. Item 15 arrived in late November of year 8. A message from my mother on a social media platform I had not expected her to have. Longer than anything she had sent before. She said she had been thinking deeply about our relationship. She said she felt we had both said things that had damaged us and she wondered if I would be open to a conversation. She said she missed me. She said family was the most important thing and she hoped I had not forgotten that. She did not say she was sorry. She said she wondered if I would be open to a conversation. I read it over 3 days. I talked to Dr. Pierce for 2 sessions about it. I called Ngozi the evening after the second session and read the message to her out loud. Ngozi listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. Then she said, "She is reaching out. That is real. But reaching out is not the same as accountability." I wrote that sentence in a notebook I keep for things I need to hold but not file. I did not respond to item 15. Items 16, 17, and 18 were follow-up messages over the next 6 weeks. Each a variation of the same shape. Hoping to hear. Missing me. Wondering if I would be open. Each arriving without the word sorry. Each arriving without naming the driveway, the document, the phone call, the wedding, the contested will. 3 messages. 6 weeks. Nothing that named what had actually happened. Filed. Dated. Items 16, 17, 18. If this is landing somewhere in you, if you have ever been the one in your family whose version of events got quietly replaced by a version that let everyone else off the hook, drop a comment. Tell me what you carried and for how long. Because I think more of us have built our own folders than we have ever been willing to say out loud. And if you are not already here, subscribe to Reckoning episodes. Item 19 was the one that changed the shape of everything. It was a message from Toby. My youngest brother was 23. He had been 11 years old when I left the family. He had grown up entirely inside the version of events my parents had constructed, the version in which I had walked away from people who loved me for reasons that reflected poorly on my character. He had never been told about the document. Never been told about the phone call or the driveway or the contested will. He had been handed a story when he was 11 years old and he had lived inside it for 12 years because the story was internally consistent and everyone around him believed it and there was no counter-narrative anywhere in his environment. His message said he had recently had a difficult conversation with our parents about a decision in his own life and they had responded in a way he had not expected. And in the middle of that conversation he had heard our mother describe my departure from the family as a choice I had made. And something in him, at 23, having just watched them do a version of the same thing to him that he was only just beginning to understand, had cracked open enough space for a question he had never been able to ask before. He wrote, "What actually happened, Adise?" I sat with that message for a full day. I wanted to be certain, before I answered, about the reason I was answering. Not to damage my parents. Not to recruit an ally. Because he had asked, directly, for the truth, and I had spent 15 years keeping the truth in a folder for exactly this kind of moment. I called him. 3 hours and 17 minutes. I told him everything. Calmly, in the order it had happened. I walked him through the folder item by item. The document from when I was 18. The transcript of the phone call. The driveway. The email cutting off the money. Emika's 3-sentence message asking for an apology without once asking how I was. The wedding report from Chisholm. The contested will. Items 15 through 18, the 4 messages that arrived over 8 years without the word sorry. Toby was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "They told me you left." I said, "I know." He said, "That is not what happened." I said, "No. It is not." He cried on that call. The kind of cry that does not have any performance in it, that just comes out of a person whether or not they are prepared for it. I did not try to redirect it or soften it. I let it be what it was. We stayed on the phone for another 40 minutes after that, talking about smaller things, his work, my work, a book I had been reading, a restaurant he liked. Like siblings. Like 2 people who had been placed on opposite sides of a structure for 12 years and had just found that the structure had a door in it the whole time. 3 months later, Chisholm called. She had been talking with Toby. She had been doing her own thinking. She had been 15 when I left and had watched from inside the house and had built her own accommodation with the story she had been given, the way you do when you are 15 and the family requires a version you can repeat without disrupting things. She said, "I used to tell people you chose to leave. Because I needed it to make sense." She said this as a confession, not an excuse, and I received it exactly that way. We were on the phone for 2 hours and 14 minutes. Some of her memories of that period matched mine. Some did not. We did not argue about the ones that diverged. We held them alongside each other and let them be what they were. At the end, she said she was sorry. Not for what our parents had done. For the 15 years she had spent carrying the wrong story as though it were true. I told her I understood. I told her that made two of us. For weeks after Chisholm's call, my father called. His voice was different. Older, which was expected. But also careful, measured in the way a person sounds when they have thought carefully about what they intend to say and are still not certain they have it right. He said my name. I said hello. He paused for 3 seconds. He said he had heard I had been speaking with Toby and Chisholm and he hoped whatever I had shared with them was accurate. I said I had shared documentation. 7 seconds of silence. I counted. He said, "We would like to talk. Your mother and I." A conversation. I said I was not ready for that yet. He said, "When will you be ready?" I said, "I do not know. But not yet." He said, "We are not getting younger, at ease." I said, "I understand that." He said, "What would you need for this conversation to be possible?" I said, "I would need you to read the folder." Silence. He said, "What folder?" I said, "I have been keeping records since I was 19 years old. Every document, every voicemail transcript, every report, every message. 29 items. All labeled, all dated. If we are going to have a real conversation, both of you need to read those 29 items first. Not to argue about them. So that we are all talking about what actually happened rather than the version that has been circulating for 15 years. 11 seconds. He said, "Send them." I did not send them that night. I called Dr. Pierce in the morning. I called Ngozi. I sat with the decision for 14 days. That is how long I had learned it takes me to make a decision I can actually stand behind rather than one I make out of momentum or pressure or the fear of seeming slow. Then I organized the folder. All 29 items. I wrote a brief factual note for each one, what this document is, when it arrived, what the surrounding circumstances were. No editorializing. No interpretation beyond the minimum needed for context. I assembled them in chronological order and I read them all the way through, start to finish, from item 1 to item 29. 3 hours and 22 minutes. When I finished, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water and I looked at what I had built across 15 years. And what I saw was not a case for anger. It was a record of a family. Every way a family can fail each other and love each other and misrepresent each other and carry each other forward badly and still be made of the same blood. The hard items were in there. So was Mama Chibi's card with the yellow flowers. So was my father sitting in the third row of a school auditorium on a Saturday morning when he had a city project he could have used as his excuse not to come. I sent the folder with a single message: "This is not an accusation. It is a record. Read it. If you want a conversation afterward, tell me you have read it and what you want to say." 10 days passed. On the 11th day, a message came from my mother. The longest she had ever sent me, longer than any of the 18 that had come before it. The previous ones had felt like invitations. This one felt like something else. She described reading the folder. She said she and my father had gone through it together over 2 evenings. She named specific items. She said she had not remembered the phone call the way the transcript showed. She said she had not thought about the wedding comment in years. She said she did not remember making it. And then she wrote something I had not expected. She said that not remembering it did not mean she had not made it, and that she was beginning to understand that this distinction mattered. Then she wrote, "I told you that you were dead to us." I remember the feeling that led to those words better than I remember the words themselves. But you kept the words. And I think I knew, even when I said them, that they were words you would keep. Then, I am sorry. Not, I am sorry you were hurt. Not, I am sorry for how things turned out. I am sorry. I read it 4 times that day. I read it again the next morning. I saved it not in the folder. In a separate file I started that evening, one with no tab and no label, that is not a record of what was done to me but a record of what came after. Because the folder was the record of 15 years of silence and distance and the story being told wrong. That message did not belong in that record. It belonged in the part of the story that begins when the record has done its work. 3 weeks after that message, my parents asked to meet in person. I agreed. I drove to Akron. I parked on the same street with the oak tree that nobody ever fully raked. I went inside. My mother had placed a document on the kitchen table. Her document. Bullet points. Dates. At the bottom it said I owed this family an apology and a return. An acknowledgement, in front of the pastor of Christ Embassy, that my choices had caused harm. A commitment to re-engagement with the community on terms the family considered appropriate. She slid it across the table toward me. Deliberately, with both hands, eyes level. The way she had always handled things she wanted to be final. I did not touch it. I reached into the bag I had brought with me and I placed the binder on the table next to her document. 15 years thick. Tabbed sections. 29 items, each labeled, each dated, each one sleeved in a clear plastic cover so the original documents were visible without being touched. I did not open it. I did not read from it. I placed it on the table and I left my hand flat on top of it and I looked at my mother and I waited. She looked at the binder for a long time. She looked at me. She looked at her document. There was a silence in that kitchen that lasted 18 seconds. I counted. Then my father, who had said nothing since I sat down, said, "Put it away, Neka." She looked at him. Then she picked up her document. She folded it in half. She set it down to the side. And then we sat in the kitchen of the house where I grew up and we talked for 2 hours and 11 minutes. No script. No agenda. No document between us except the binder, which stayed on the table the entire time like a quiet third party, like a witness, which is exactly what it had always been. My mother cried twice during that conversation. The first time was when I asked her if she had ever told Toby what had actually happened, not the departure but the specific events that preceded it, the document, the phone call, the driveway, the exact words. She went quiet for a long time. Then she said no. She said she had told him the version she could live with. That was not anger in her voice when she said it. It was something smaller and more honest. The second time she cried was when I described what it had been like to not have family in the audience when I graduated, to walk across the stage and look out at the seats and know there was no one there for me. She did not try to defend either of those things. She did not explain them or minimize them or contextualize them into something more manageable. She sat with them. That was new. In 34 years of knowing her, I had not seen her sit with something she could not control. My father said very little during the 2 hours. But he refilled my water glass without being asked, which was, I understood by now, the closest he knew how to come to saying certain things without having the words available for them. And he stayed in the room. For the full 2 hours and 11 minutes, he stayed in the room. In our family, staying in a room when things were difficult was not nothing. It was close to everything. At the end of the 2 hours he said, "I am glad you came." I said, "I am too." I drove home that evening and I sat in my apartment for a long time without turning on any lights. Not from sadness. Not from relief exactly. From the particular feeling of being at the end of something that has been going on for so long that you stopped expecting it to have an end. The binder was on the passenger seat beside me. 29 items. 15 years. One oak tree on a street in Akron that nobody ever fully raked. I have spoken to my parents 3 times since that kitchen table. The conversations are slow. There are long pauses where people are working out what they actually mean to say. My mother cried during the second call. My father said almost nothing during the third but stayed on the phone for 47 minutes, which I have come to understand is, for him, a significant thing to say. The silence is different now. It is not the silence of a verdict. It is the silence of people who are working out what comes next. Emeka has not called. I do not know if he will. I have made my peace with not knowing. 15 years. 29 items. One binder with tabbed sections on the second shelf of the closet in my home office. That is what it took. Not a confrontation in a driveway. Not a letter sent in anger at 19 that they could have dismissed and used against me for a decade. Not a public declaration or a dramatic scene or a speech I had written and rehearsed. A record. Quiet. Methodical. Accurate. Built one item at a time over 15 years by a woman who was not certain she would ever use it and used it anyway when the moment arrived. I want to speak directly to you now, because I know this story belongs to more people than just me. If you are the person in your family whose version of events gets quietly replaced by a cleaner version that leaves you out, you already know what that does to your sense of what is real. You replay the conversations. You look for where you went wrong. You start to wonder if the story they tell is the accurate one and your memory is the distortion. That doubt is not weakness. That is what happens when the people who were supposed to tell you the truth about yourself choose a different story instead, and they have more voices and more social infrastructure than you do, and they have been repeating their version for long enough that it has calcified into fact for everyone around them. The folder was my answer to that doubt. Every returned card, every ignored voicemail, every screenshot. Every time the doubt came, I could open the binder. I could read what was actually there. 29 items. Dated. Labeled. Real. Not my interpretation of an event. The documents themselves, in the original language they arrived in, with the original dates on them. The record does not drift. The record does not revise itself to be kinder to anyone. The record does not wake up one morning and decide that things were more complicated than they appeared, that both sides had a point, that the distance was mutual and the fault was shared. The record is just what happened. Item 1 through item 29. Dated. The original documents in the original language they arrived in. That is what I had for 15 years when the doubt came. That is what I opened. That is what held. That is what I would do again. Family is not the people who share your last name. Family is not the people who arrive when the business profile runs in the regional publication and suddenly they always knew you had it in you. Family is the people who showed up when there was nothing to gain from showing up. Mama Chabiz, calling every Sunday at 7 o'clock in the evening and asking to speak to me first. Ngozi, spending 3 weeks making phone calls to track down an address to send a letter to a 19-year-old she was not supposed to contact. Toby, at 23, asking the question that everyone else in that family had decided, years ago, not to ask. I had family the whole time. I just had to learn to count it differently than I had been taught to count. The conversation with my parents is not finished. I do not know what it becomes. What I know is that my mother said I am sorry without a qualification attached to it. What I know is that my father put away her document without me having to ask him to. What I know is that those 2 things, small as they are against 15 years, are a beginning. A real beginning. Not a resolution. I do not do resolutions. The record does not allow for them, and I have learned, over 15 years of keeping it, to trust the record more than I trust any feeling that something is finished. If something in this story reminded you that your worth was never in the hands of the people who decided to write you out of their version of events, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. and drop a comment. Tell me, have you ever kept your own folder? Your own record? Your own documentation of what actually happened, held quietly for longer than you expected to hold it? Because I think more of us have than we have ever admitted. And I think we deserve to say so out loud. Drop a comment, subscribe to Reckoning episodes, and I will see you in the next one.